The acronym DDR stands for Double Data Rate. It's called that because the original DDR version 1, was synchronous DRAM, or SDRAM, that had been double pumped so that it could transfer twice the data per cycle. At this point, DDR is all we use, so the bottom line is this. DDR transfers twice the data compared to older types of RAM. What is more important for the exam and for the IT field is the versions of DDR. Though it isn't often seen or used anymore, a typical example of DDR1 is shown in the figure. DDR1 would typically run at speeds of 200 megahertz, and therefore it would be called DDR-200, and it could transfer 1600 megabytes per second. These RAM sticks have 184 pins for connectivity to the RAM slot in the motherboard. But 1600 megabytes per second is not nearly fast enough. So its successor, DDR2, decreased voltage and increased speed. A typical example of DDR2 would be DDR2-800, also known as PC2-6400, because it can transfer a maximum of 6400 megabytes per second. This type of DDR increased the amount of pins to 240. But both of these are uncommon. It's more likely that you'll see DDR3, DDR4, and beyond. So let's talk about DDR3 for a minute. These are not backward compatible with DDR2, even though they use the same amount of pins at 240. Note the orientation notch here. This is in a different location compared to DDR2, so it's not backward compatible, and you wouldn't even be able to install it if you tried. This table shows typical DDR3 modules and their peak data transfer rates. And these are typical modules that you'll still see in the field for some time to come, and possibly on the exam. Note that the transfers per second measurement is often counted in millions. For example, DDR3-1600 can do 1600 million transfers per second, which is the same as 1600 mega transfers per second, and that's written as MT/S, mega transfers per second. And you can see the different versions here. DDR3-1600 is also known as PC3-12800. And so the 1600 in the name here tells us how many mega transfers it does per second. And in this name, we see basically the peak data transfer rate, which is 12,800 megabytes per second. And the math is pretty simple. It's really just a matter of multiplying by 8. So for example, DDR3-2400, if we multiply that by 8, we'll get the peak data transfer rate of 19,200 megabytes per second, and we're solving for bytes. DDR4 is currently the most common type of RAM on new PCs as of the recording of this video in late 2018. It is 288 pins, so a different architecture, and therefore not compatible with older versions of DDR. DDR4 reduces the voltage even further, generally down to 1.2 volts or even lower, and it increases the data transfer. So here's a table of typical DDR4 modules. For example, in a previous video, we talked about 4 sticks of DRAM that we installed to a computer, and that was DDR4-2133. which has a peak data transfer rate of 17,000 megabytes per second. Compare this to going all the way back to DDR1, which could do 1,600 megabytes per second. This is 10 times the amount of data. So DDR4-2133, that's also known as PC4-17,000. Now, you'll actually notice some overlap from DDR3 to DDR4. This is common, but remember that DDR4 is designed to work more efficiently, use less power, and run cooler than DDR3.
As of the recording of this video, DDR5 is the latest of the DDR standards. It was released in 2020, with modules arriving to the consumer market in 2021. The voltage for a standard DDR5 memory module is 1.1 volts, so it uses less power than DDR4. Like DDR4, it has 288 pins, but there are physical differences between the two, so DDR5 is not backward compatible with DDR4. The maximum density of a DDR5 module is 64 gigabytes compared to DDR4's 16 gigabytes. Here we have some typical DDR5 modules. Now, the clock rate for DDR5 currently, as of the recording of this video, ranges between 2400 and 3600 megahertz. And you double that number to get your module standard. So for example, a typical speed, quote unquote, for DDR5 would be 2400 megahertz. And this particular module here is DDR5 4800, which means 4800 mega transfers per second. At that speed, the RAM can transfer a maximum of 38,400 megabytes per second, or 38.4 gigabytes per second. And the module name, if you were to purchase it, would be called PC5-38400. Another typical speed is 6400. DDR5 6400 modules can transfer 51,200 megabytes per second. And that module name would be PC5-51200. And as of the recording of this video, the fastest one is DDR5 7200, which could do 57.6 gigabytes per second. But new versions, new modules, higher speeds are always coming out, so be on the lookout for those. Now, as with previous versions of DDR, the goals for DDR5 are to reduce power consumption, and we do that with a lesser voltage, and also increase the bandwidth so that the device can work faster, transmit more data per second, and work more efficiently. And here's an alert for you. Know your pinouts for DDR. DDR3 is 240 pin. DDR4 and DDR5 are 288 pin. And none are backward compatible. That means that you cannot put a DDR5 module in a motherboard that has DDR4 slots. You cannot put a DDR3 module in a motherboard that has DDR5 slots, and so on and so on. None of these are backward compatible. So memorize the amount of pins for each type of DDR and know that you have to have a compatible motherboard for whatever type of memory you are using.